them, which immediately then became a much more serious condition, because if I carry on singing now, it's not just a question of doing a terrible show or anything, it's actually a question of then there being a permanent damage which can only be alleviated by operation. And I mean, it's not an uncommon operation to have, but it's one that has a certain element of risk that you don't ever get back to normal after it. And also it means in itself the operation is a couple of months of silence after it. So
how long do you have between now and the Australian tour?
7 days.
That's it?
Well, it was going to be 5. I mean, that's why I'm flying back to England now, because at least I can stay in one place and in a fairly humid atmosphere for 7 days, and then fly on to Sydney.
All right, we're ready whenever you
Okay. We all set? Do we have speed?
So we're going to do this like an interview.
Yeah.
You're going to be swapped for
Carla.
Right, so I'll talk to you, not to camera, right? Okay.
Ready? Ian, what does the term progressive rock mean to you?
Well, I think the word progressive in relation to rock always suggests something to do with musicality. I think it also suggests some level of invention, some creativity, something that's a bit special, for want of a better word. But I think it always suggests musicality. Now, whether that musicality is the overblown, overly dramatic, pompous sort of music of bands like Emerson, Lake and Palmer, or Yes, or Jethro Tull, you know, from the 70s period, or whether it's actually, should we say, the more accepted sort of musicality of bands, progressive jazz rock groups like Weather Report or whatever. I mean, it still suggests the ability to play your instrument well, inventively, and to be a sort of master of it. That's really what progressive rock suggests to me. All of that combined with originality and something which is up, is aggressive, and is not perhaps always just the boy meets girl kind of lyrical material. Now, whether or not we could embrace in that such diverse efforts as Sgt. Pepper, which is a classic, inventive pop music album, I wouldn't say it was progressive rock, but it's certainly progressive in the sense that it combined a lot of ideas in a pop context that have never really been used before. And obviously it's an incredibly original and beautifully written and executed piece of work. Whether that is progressive rock or whether it's progressive pop, I'm not sure. Again, if you go to the other extreme of, as I mentioned, somebody like Weather Report, who again are progressive, original, and doing something different. But it's not quite, I mean, that again has such an origin in what is accepted, formalized jazz in terms of the background of the musicians. Again, maybe that doesn't fit the bill. So I guess you're left with what seems to be that rather overblown, pompous sort of contribution from the mid-70s groups. Now, I personally believe that in the context of the 1980s, there are bands that still, whether it's fashionable or not to call them progressive rock, I think they still fly that same banner. And I mean, I would include Thomas Dolby or bands like The Fix, who still demonstrate great musicality and a not quite mainstream approach to pop music. It's still rock music rather than pop to me, what The Fix do. And on their most recent album, Phantoms, the song Phantom Living, which is, to me, is just, on hearing it, I mean, immediately is just great stuff, you know, and I wouldn't just call that, well, just plain old pop music. That's something special, you know, and so I think the flag of progressive rock is still flying, but no one really wants to call it progressive rock music anymore. But it certainly ain't just, you know, common or garden sort of, you know, run-of-the-mill pop music as far as I'm concerned. There are some special things still happening and always will be happening.
Do you think that the genre was born from the artist's need to stretch themselves musically?
I think the artists always feel a need to stretch themselves musically, but I think that perhaps the main thrust is something that stems from I don't know, having gone to art school or had a classical music training or whatever it might be. It comes from a slightly more intellectual standpoint as well. Perhaps when we bear in mind the original notion for this particular program, divulging all our secrets to the viewers now, was that it should be art rock rather than progressive rock. And I mean, the two they come very close together in some ways. Art rock, however, is an even more fanciful, an even more limiting description of a slightly different genre than progressive rock is, which I think why we went back with the progressive rock notion as embracing more. But certainly there's that slightly arty sort of thing you can never get away from, and that always brings about a cynical attitude from critics who get a little bit suspicious when anyone involved in the pop or rock music business gets too pretentious, and that's a very good safety valve to have, because otherwise pop music does, from time to time, and one has been guilty of this oneself, let it get way out of control, you know, and that's a lot of fun at the time, but musically and artistically it's a sort of cul-de-sac that you don't want to stay in for too long. So yeah, sure, playing the instrument is part of it, but I think there's always that slightly artistic pretension which, if you're going to do it, be unabashed about it and have a good time.
Is it, Ian, primarily a British phenomena? And if so, why?
Certainly there seem to be an awful lot of British bands that have taken that route, and I still say are still taking it now, you know, in amongst the new bands too. But I would, you know, throw up names like Captain Beefheart and his Magic Band circa 1973, the Spotlight Kid album. That to me was about something special. It was still, if you were going to call it anything, you still have to call it progressive rock music, I think. And it was peculiarly American. I mean, really American music. Obviously, Captain Beefheart was not a hero in this country. We actually took him on tour as a support band once, and he got booed off most nights. I mean, it was very sad because we loved the band, and they were in fact very popular in Britain and elsewhere in Europe. And indeed, I think have probably spent, without knowing it, have become a very influential band for a lot of groups who are around now who perhaps grew up listening to that music back then, who certainly developed the penchant for calling their musicians by ridiculous names. I mean, Captain Beefheart had a band consisting of Zoot Horn Rollo, Winged Eel Fingerling, Rocket Morton, and people like that, which I mean were terrific names, and of course weren't their real names. And everybody thought that was very strange back then. Now, of course, every band uses once again far more inventive names than perhaps even than that.
Would you put Zappa in the category of American progressive rock?
I would, but I'm sure he wouldn't, because I think Frank Zappa likes British rock music and doesn't really like being part of anything. He's always seemed to be rather cynical and have a bit of a chip on his shoulder about something, which I don't understand. Never met the man, but again, I would put him as, you know, right up there in terms of American progressive rock music as being a very influential person. Not in as much as his music may have not directly influenced people, but what he stood for certainly influenced a lot of people, including me. So I may not have influenced Frank Zappa, but in his own way, I'm sure he's influenced me and people of, you know, my ilk, who at least felt brave enough to stand up on their own 2 feet and try and do something a bit more adventurous musically, having seen dear old Frank having a go.
Who do you consider the pioneers of progressive rock?
Well, I suppose if you go back to early things like the early concept albums, like the Moody Blues had a record out called Days of Future Past, which was wasn't something I particularly thought was a great record, but again, it was of its type. It was something suddenly different. It was that notion of the concept, the overall musical concept in an album, which was very brave, very forward-looking. And from that, a number of bands took that kind of a theme. I suppose the first sort of progressive rock that influenced me in any musical way was very early Pink Floyd, the very first album, Piper at the Gates of Dawn, which I found to be a terrific lesson in combining quirky songwriting with, you know, then amazing sound effects and amazing theatricality on stage. So although again they were perhaps more in the art rock genre as they were perceived at the time, I mean they were still truly progressive in the sense that it unleashed a whole new kind of influence for a lot of musicians in England. Now the Pink Floyd, I think, in their own little way were kind of not exactly copying, but certainly paralleling anyway something that was already happening in the United States at the time. So I guess there were some of those early US bands, I mean, with light shows buzzing around and in the Fillmore's East and West and whatever else, all that was already kind of happening. But the Floyd were the first we really saw of it in Europe anyway, in terms of combining it with a theatrical performance that was more than just pop image. It was a whole new thing, you know. It's quite fun. I always remember meeting Syd Barrett backstage. We were supporting them before we were called Jethro Tull in some little gig somewhere in the north of England, and it was a pretty seedy place, and this mysterious guy was standing alone backstage just gazing at himself in a full-length mirror, wearing a cloak with a hole in it and smoking a small cigar. And I, being a sort of fairly cheerful lad, he went up and said, "Hi, you know, I'm Ian." And he just looked at me with a cold gaze and went back to, you know, combing his hair and preening himself in front of this mirror. And I just thought he was a weird roadie or something, but he then materialized on stage playing a completely out-of-tune guitar with mirrors all over it, and I thought he was great. But anyway, enough storytelling.
Storytelling is always wonderful. Did you set out to...
Especially when you make it up. No, go on.
Did you set out to execute a particular vision for Jethro Tull, or did it just evolve?
No, I think when Jethro Tull first started, we were anything but a progressive rock band, if that is indeed what we are. We began as a blues group, really just doing a lot of very conventional third-hand blues riffs and, in fact, fairly standard stock blues tunes that were the stuff that you played around the blues clubs in England just to make the most basic of livings. And we began early on in our performance to sort of slightly deviate from the mainstream of blues, because we introduced some elements of, I was going to say comedy. Comedy is perhaps not the right word, just irreverency about it. You know, we didn't take it too seriously. And then we started to write a couple of songs of our own that were kind of in a blues vein, but were just slightly away from it enough to make us seem different. And we then, at the time we became popular, we were popular as a blues-based group rather than a purist blues group like the early Fleetwood Mac were, or Ainsley Dunbar, or John Mayall, or Peter Green, you know, in his sort of later life. And I mean, all of that was very, very purist. We were not by the time we became popular, and so as soon as we got noticed by enough people, we started to rely on our own songwriting, and that took us well away from blues, using other influences, which were obviously our music's always been very eclectic, and is so even now. In other words, it uses a lot of influence from a lot of different sources, and we put those together, hopefully not in a pastiche form. We try to make the edges dovetail a bit, you know, but it is nonetheless eclectic. And perhaps that very eclecticism is something that also is shared by a lot of other bands, like, again, if we mentioned Yes or Emerson, Lake and Palmer. There are a lot of different things in there, you know, that are coming together, sometimes awkwardly, but still with something special going for them. So maybe that very eclectic nature is a very important thing as well, sort of almost a clashing of different influences somehow almost meeting, you know. This can be exciting.
You talked a little while ago about the theatricality of Pink Floyd. How important has it been to Jethro Tull?
Well, theatricality is sort of, it comes with the show in the sense that you go out there on the stage and either you are that way inclined or you're not. And I never rehearse things to do with performance. Sometimes things that involve props or particular stage dressings, I mean, they will get introduced usually the last minute in dress rehearsals, because obviously you can't just suddenly conjure up a piece of staging or flats or special drapes and tabs and things that, you know, literally as you walk on stage for the first time, you've got to build them, you've got to put them together. But we don't always know what we're going to do with them, because I think for me the fun of going on stage is that at least the first night of a tour, you will be doing a lot of improvising. Hopefully you know the music reasonably well, but in terms of the way you perform it, it's just going to be off the wall, you know, for the first couple of weeks. Then the things that begin to click into place, you know, become repeated, they become part of a formulated performance. And that might then suggest that it becomes relatively dull after that and everything settles into a routine. But in its own way, the little routine that you've now built up allows you the security on stage to start looking for other, you know, little things to do, crazy things to do, or subtleties to do. It's a base from which you can then look even further. So the latter parts of tours are often very interesting because you have a pretty standard sort of operating mode then, into which you can perhaps even take more risks or take some more chances and change arrangements of songs to do whatever you do as you go along. So it doesn't become boring, in fact. It just stops becoming so nerve-wracking as it is in the first couple of weeks, when it's just, you don't really know what you're going to say or where you're going to move, and the spotlight operators are, you know, wetting their pants every night because they just never know where you're going to be.
Do you, how much influence do you think that opera had on progressive rock, and does any of your material qualify as rock opera?
Well, I actually don't think that opera ever had any influence on music, full stop. I mean, I detest opera. But I mean, the term rock opera is something that was coined, I think, before The Who did Tommy, probably going back to, now I can't remember the name, some peculiar thing in Britain that was done was supposedly a rock opera, but it never actually got released as such. It was sort of done.
The Kinks and Arthur, or back further than that?
Oh no, this is going back a bit further than that. Name escapes me, but obviously the one that everybody remembers is Tommy. And Tommy, I've got a feeling when we did the Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Circus, which was another of those things that never really happened in the end, and the Who were on that, and I think they were doing stuff then from Tommy. Whether it was just it was before the album, I don't know, but I mean, this is going back 1969, 68, 69, somewhere around there. I'm sure I remember the Who doing some stuff that sounded suspiciously like, sort of, in that vein. Certainly, you know, very conceptual lyrically and all the rest of it. And but I don't think it had much to do with opera, because it wasn't being theatrically acted out. It was still being performed by a rock group in conventional rock group circumstances. I mean, Roger Daltrey was not dressing up in, you know, in special clothes. It didn't have theatrical sets. It wasn't an opera in that sense. It was, of course, done. I know it was done because I actually got asked to be one of the to be something in it. I can't remember what. When they staged it later on in a full theatrically glorious performance in the Rainbow Theatre in London. And I know that I think they did a few shows where they did Tommy as a full-blown theatrical, operatic kind of a thing. I mean, they had people like Richard Harris and you know, proper actors, and plus a lot of singers and whatever doing it in a very grandiose fashion. As I say, I was asked to do something. I was probably on tour or wasn't available. I didn't even get to see it in the end, but that might have been an attempt to take it into a more theatrical context. But I don't think that ever in the first place it was an opera in the sense that it really was opera. No, don't think so.
Many consider to be aqualung. Many consider to be aqualung. That's good English, isn't it? Many consider aqualung to be. Let's try that.
Oh,
Good.